Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Midnight Special, it's a sci-fi movie, but it's really about the relationship between Alton and his father. Could you tell me about that relationship, first of all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I write, I always write on these two tracks. One is a kind of a plot track, and that's where the genre elements come in. That's where the car chases and, kind of the cool stuff that get people into the theater. That's where that happens. But on the other hand, I try and relate these films to something very personal in my life. And I try and look at what's going on in my own life, and I try and find a really palpable emotion that can kind of make it through the gauntlet of the filmmaking process, and hopefully by the end of it, transfer over to the audience. And in this particular case, it was how I felt about my son. At the time that I was writing this, he was going from 8 months old to 2 years old. And my mind was kind of blown by being a new young father. I was terrified, to be quite honest. And I was just trying to understand, what my role was as a father. And when I started to figure that out, that oddly enough became the through line for the movie.
Tell me about some of those feelings and what you were afraid of exactly.
Well, sure. When my son was 8 months old, he had something called a febrile seizure. It's the body's reaction to a spike in fever. About 1 in 1,000 kids have it. It doesn't have any permanent effects. But for my wife and I, it was terrifying. He started to convulse. He started to turn gray. His eyes rolled back in his head. And, we raced him to the emergency room. And I was running through just yelling, my baby can't breathe. Help us. And it was like dipping my head in a cold bucket of water or something. I was shocked by the reality that at any moment, this boy could be taken away from me. And there's a lot of fear that comes with that. Mm-hmm. And, I had made this film take shelter, which was very much about fear. But I had also realized through the course of that fear in and of itself is not a point. It's not a thought. It's really a catalyst for a thought. So I started to examine it and say, well, all right, how do I process this fear? What do I do as a parent? And, your initial reaction is to try and take control of a situation when you're afraid. You try and control the environment that your child lives in, make it a safe environment. You try and control who they're going to become as a person. But oddly enough, those are negative results.
Impulses,
yeah, because we all know we can't control them. We have no control over them. So, all right, then why am I here? What does it mean to be a father and to help my child? And I realized, well, it seems to be this constant job of defining who he is. And as he grows, redefining who he is and who he needs to be and who he's becoming. And that's really what Mike Shannon's character in the film is doing, is he's just trying to understand this thing that is unknowable, because we don't know really who they're going to turn into.
Yeah.
But you want to try and understand, you want to try and help them.
Were you figuring this out as you were writing the film, as you were shooting the film?
Definitely as I was writing it.
Yeah.
But, the way I write, I heavily outline. These things are kind of meticulously constructed. So I actually don't start typing the screenplay itself until I've got a full outline of every scene, of every transition. So that's really the quote-unquote writing process. And that's when I'm thinking about it. This is a sci-fi chase movie, so there's a point A and a point B. I actually had a lot of the plot in place before I knew what the movie was about. And I remember there was some point where I just stopped myself from adding more plot scenes and just said, okay, I've got to figure out what all this means. And that's when I really started to think about that relationship.
What is that like for you, discovering something so important to your real life in the process of making a film? I mean, I'd imagine some writers have their head around a situation and then they write it, but sounds like you were discovering this as you were going.
Yeah, it's pretty cathartic, But again, I think it goes back to what I'm trying to do as a filmmaker. I don't really care about plot, and if you've seen my films, you understand that that's not the thing that's out front. I don't write in 3-act structure. Endings are a kind of a, ethereal thing to me. I don't think they're the most important thing. I think the most important thing is to convey an emotion to the audience, to have them emotionally affected when they walk out of the theater. That's success. And so, for me, I just look at my life and look at something that is really palpable. If I feel it that intensely, then maybe, just maybe, I'll have the chance to transfer that to the audience.
It's interesting. I was reading through articles and interviews that you'd done. You said something about directing and how it's this balance between having this original idea and also being fluid with what happens.
Sure.
And it kind of struck me that I'd imagine that's something like parenting, where you try to have a plan and try to have some level of control, but at the same time you have to be open to
Yeah,
what's going on.
You're building the bridge that you're walking across. You just kind of have to constantly, I think, re-examine where you're at as a filmmaker. There are just so many variables. I know this term auteur gets thrown around a lot, and it's been attached to my name. And though it's flattering, it's really absolutely not true. I have this group of people that help me craft these films. Not just Mike Shannon, who's been in all 4, now 5 of my films. But my cinematographer's worked on all of my films, my production designer, my costume designer. These are all people that help me craft these things. So really, when you get to the variables on set, you're leaning on a massive amount of people to help you. To help you be fluid.
So what's more important then as a director, to be someone who is good at controlling things, or to be someone who's very open to ambiguity?
I think I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think it's the job of a director to actually always have an answer, and that's really more about process than it is about storytelling. We're separating the two things here. When you're standing there on set and an actor walks up to you and says, "I don't understand why I'm doing this in a scene. I don't understand the behavior here," then I think you have to be very clear about why you wrote it. And if you don't have the answer, then there's a problem.
That's a big problem.
That's a problem. And I think the one thing I do I'll just pat myself on the back here for a second, is I do so carefully construct these scenes. I really do think about character behavior in these scenes, so that when the actors get them, they may not always agree with everything that a character's doing, but they know I've at least thought about it.
You have a rationale.
Yeah.
So both of them are important and not mutually exclusive.
Right.
What about as a parent? Is there one that's more important than the other?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I maybe am figuring out how to make movies. I absolutely haven't figured out how to be a parent.
So this is a story about that relationship, father and son relationship. Why is a sci-fi movie a good vehicle for that sort of story?
Maybe it's not. I don't know. I'm kind of a geek. I was raised in the 80s, and I was raised on movies like Close Encounters and
Your
E.T.
father took you to a lot of movies?
Yeah, absolutely. My dad was a geek too. He didn't have many friends, so we didn't go fishing. We didn't go hunting. We went to movies. And I grew up in Arkansas, where we didn't have foreign cinema. We didn't have auteur cinema. We just had movies. And so when I think about the enjoyment of going into a theater and the lights going down and the screen, lighting up, I think about movies like Close Encounters. I think about movies like E.T. And, who doesn't want to try that on their own? Now, the question for me is, can I ground such a film? Can I put myself into such a film? And I think there's a nice balance there. I think if I was just making genre films, they might be hollow. But if I was just making personal films, they might be melodramatic. Mm-hmm. But the two kind of balance each other.
That's another difficult balance to kind of appeal, like these movies appealed, E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and also make something that's unique to you.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Close Encounters, which I think is one of the most masterfully directed films I've ever seen, just look at the opening scenes of American suburb life. I think they're extraordinarily realistic. That's what life looked like to me. If you go to Richard Dreyfuss's house at the beginning of that film, you've got a playpen, not with the baby in it, but with a 4-year-old like banging a stick on the edge of it, and some kid always hitting the piano. There was just chaos in those houses, but it looked very realistic. So obviously Spielberg wasn't just off to the side figuring out what aliens are supposed to look like. He was really trying to capture what American life looked like at that time, and I respect that.
I said off the top that we don't see a lot of movies like that anymore. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think part of it has to do with the prevalence of CGI work and everything else. You can do so much now, and audiences have seen so much. They kind of require. It feels like they require more spectacle, and the more you go down the path of spectacle, the further away you get from reality. And that's not the kind of filmmaker I am.
Was that a challenge for you then with this film? Because you had access to some CGI, some technology.
Yeah, no, not really, because of the way it was constructed from the beginning. I don't know. It seemed to come in when it needed to come in, but also our approach. It's the way you hear Christopher Nolan approaches effects. He tries to make them as practical as possible until you just absolutely can't. So even with the boy's eyes, the character in this film, his eyes, emit these beams of light. That was a practical effect 90% of the time that we did on set. So we just tried to make it as organic as possible.
So before this movie, you made smaller dramas like Take Shelter and Mud, lots of critical acclaim, but smaller budgets and smaller audiences. Now you're working with Warner Brothers.
Right.
How do you stay true to your ideas about film and story while still reaching a wider audience? That's always been your intention.
Yeah, I think it's just about clarity when you're going into the process. Movie making can be a dangerous thing, and it's because everybody has an opinion while you're making films. And opinions are a good thing. They're a good thing to collect and react to. That being said, I think there is one director. There's one person in charge, and what I've been very good at, I think, I've been just unsuccessful enough in my career that I haven't been offered some giant film to the point to where I was willing to give up my own controls just in order to get a job. Mm-hmm. So when I went to Warner Brothers, I was very clear. The script was written. I knew I wanted Mike Shannon in the lead, and it's perfectly fine if they don't want to make this film. But I was very clear about this was the film I wanted to make. And, these people aren't jerks. They aren't trying to, subvert your ideas or anything like that. I think you just have to be very clear going in with what you want to do.
But they're human beings and they have opinions.
Of course. Yeah. But also, even though this is a studio film, this is still a relatively low-budget studio film. They were able to give me that control because they weren't risking that much.
Whose opinions do you trust in the process? Because it is important to let opinions in, but not too many.
Right.
And it's got to be the right people.
I have a handful of people that read my scripts. I don't do a lot of rewrites.
Fellow directors or?
Some, but really it's my producers, Sarah Green and Brian Kavanaugh Jones, that have worked with me for a long, long time. I let my dad read them, but that's mainly just because he always tells me how great they are. So you just need that ego boost.
You need that voice too.
You need that ego boost. My wife doesn't read them. She just wants to see the movies. And I let my older brother, Ben, who's in this band called Lucero, I let him read them because he's my older brother. He's the epitome of cool in my mind.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.